Thank you for joining iMeet. This meeting is now being recorded.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. This will be an AML 101 for dealers in precious metals and stones, also known as jewelers. If you are looking for another session, you are, at least vis-a-vis the next hour of time, in the wrong place. Throughout this session, I do have a couple of quick housekeeping items. All participants are currently on mute. It's not you, it's your hold music. What happens when we have a group this size, and we've had tremendous turnout for this webinar, is that when we have people that aren't on mute, we will end up having an awful lot of background noise. Someone accidentally puts us on hold, and then we're rocking out to Michael Bolton for a little bit. So rather than doing that and disrupting the flow of the webinar, we've got everyone on mute. If you need to get my attention, though, during the call, the best way to do that is to use the chat feature in iMeet. It looks like a little speech bubble. You can send a message to Rodney McInnes, who's a member of my team. And if it's urgent enough, he'll actually come up and stick a Post-it note to my screen and make sure that he's getting my attention. He will also be your main point of contact for any technical support, any issues, any questions that you have throughout the webinar. At the end, so when the presentation portion is finished, I'm going to try taking everyone off mute in order to be able to take questions. You can also submit questions using the little chat feature, so that talk bubble again, either to myself or to Rodney. You can also pose questions to the room in general. I will not be checking the chat log throughout the meeting, just because it's relatively difficult to do that and steer everything else. But as I said, Rodney will be there for you throughout the session. The session is also being recorded, so if everything goes to plan, participants will be able to review the session later. However, the recording will not be able to answer your questions. So if you're nodding off, but you had an urgent question that you wanted to ask, better to ask that now rather than later. This will be part one of the What Every Jeweler Should Know AML series. So today we're going to cover the AML basics. On May 30th, we're going to cover part two, which will be changes that are effective in June of this year. And finally, on June 13th, we're going to cover part three, which is surviving a Fintrac examination. And if any of these acronyms are baffling, I promise I will get into what they mean. Lastly, before we get started in earnest, a couple of hefty disclaimers. I'm not a lawyer. Nothing that I say should be interpreted as legal advice. I have plenty of other character flaws, I assure you. I don't represent any government or government agency. Nothing that I say should be interpreted as an official government statement or position, and that includes law enforcement. So I know an awful lot about how some of these things work, but I don't represent them officially. If you have questions about a particular situation or a particular company, if it involves someone's name, if it involves any sort of confidential information about your company, come and talk to me about that after. Give me a call. Please don't ask those questions in a public forum. And that always seems a little bit silly, but because I deal in anti-money laundering, which is what that first acronym, the AML, stands for, I have on occasion had situations where someone has put up their hand and said, oh my goodness, Bob Smith is my client, and Bob Smith is doing something that I think is pretty shady. Do I need to submit a suspicious transaction report? And those are great questions, but they're not something that should ever be asked in a public forum, in a recorded forum. I'm happy to have that conversation with you free of charge. So we can have short conversations about those types of things, and that is a service that we provide. So I'm going to start with a wall of text on a screen, which is not a thing that I like doing all of the time, but this is the legislative definition of a dealer in precious metals and stones. The important thing to know about this, because this is the definition that will lead you to figure out whether or not you need to comply with these Canadian requirements. Are you, in Canada, selling precious metals or stones as part of your business? So precious metals, gold, silver, palladium, it doesn't matter if it's bars, if it's coins, if it's ingots, if it's finished jewelry. And there are a few very specific exceptions that would make you not a dealer in precious metal and stones. So if you are only a manufacturing facility, if you are only doing extraction from a mine, if you are only someone who is cutting and polishing. So in other words, if you're doing any of those activities, and those are the entirety of your business. So I'm not buying and selling stones, I'm simply cutting and polishing them. That's a different story, and you're not a dealer in precious metals and stones. The other parameter that is applied is, have you, at any time in the past, and if you do this once, it's a one and done, then you're captured as a dealer in precious metals and stones, made a sale or a purchase of $10,000 or more. And a purchase in this case means a purchase from your suppliers. This is not specific to cash. This is simply, have I brought $10,000 worth of precious metals or stones or jewelry that involves precious metals or stones or coins or bars, any of those types of things, into my inventory. And once I've done that, it's captured. Now, the intent here is really to sort of rule out the idea that if, as part of my business, for instance, with Outlier, I once bought a gold bracelet and I bought it through my business and I sold it through my business and it was a $200 bracelet. I shouldn't be captured under this legislation. That's not my business on an ongoing basis. And that's not the intent. But as soon as that $10,000 threshold is reached in any single transaction, so the purchase of inventory, the sale of any item or group of items, then you're captured under this legislation. A dealer in precious metals and stones can be a person or a company. So you don't get an exclusion because, for instance, I didn't incorporate a company so that I could sell gold bars. I'm just doing that as an individual person, and that's my business, that's my livelihood. You would still be covered. You have to be in the business of selling precious metals or stones. So this includes jewelry, it includes coins. There is no minimum amount. So if you're selling a coin that's a gold coin, but it's only 20% gold, does it count? Yes, it counts. Again, that buy or sell transaction for your inventory or a sale to a customer at some point of $10,000 or more. If these conditions are met, you are a regulated entity in Canada for anti-money laundering or AML purposes. Anti-money laundering refers to the activities that we do to prevent, detect, and deter money laundering. And there are very specific things that we're required to do as regulated entities. But let's start with money laundering itself. This is the process of taking money, dirty money, money that comes from crime, and making it appear legitimate. So there are all sorts of crimes that could happen that would generate proceeds. Those can range from human trafficking to the sale of arms, to the trafficking of illegal narcotics, to murder for hire. There's quite a list of them that can potentially generate profits. Once that profit is generated, the criminals look for ways to move that profit through the system because they don't want to draw attention to the money. They want to keep their money safe, like all of us. They want to be able to hang on to it. These are relatively normal human goals, except for the criminal who has generated money through crime. There is a need to hide that money and to disguise what's called the source of funds. So where did the money come from? Because they can't simply go into the bank and say, hey, I've just committed a number of armed robberies. I'd like to deposit this $5,000. How is money laundered? There's generally three stages that are described. The first is placement. So most often payment for crime happens in cash, but it can happen in a number of different ways. So for instance, in our context, cash can be used to buy a product or gift cards that can later be used to buy a product. Layering. So in this phase, you see the movement of money from place to place. So I want to make it harder for law enforcement to be able to follow that trail, follow the money and figure out where it came from. So I might buy something like a very expensive watch or ring. I might not even buy it. I might simply put it on layaway and then say, oh, I've changed my mind. Or the person that I had proposed to said no, and now I need to return this ring. I know I paid for it in cash, but instead of paying for it in cash, would you mind writing me a check from your account? And now, rather than me placing my cash going back to the bank with my cash and saying, oh, I have this cash and it's a little harder to explain where it came from, I have a check that came from your store. And I can say that I sold an item that was mine. I might say that I've sold some estate jewelry. Either way, I've managed to deflect the attention as to where that money has come from. The other piece that we talk about, so we talk about AML and CTF. CTF is counter-terrorist financing. It can also be referred to as anti-terrorist financing. Those terms are interchangeable. And terrorism involves any attempt to influence or intimidate a government, the public at large, through violent or illegal means that are intended to induce fear or panic. Terrorist financing is anything that's done to fund those types of operations. And this is the important part, because this is where you and I come in, any act or omission that helps to fund terrorism. Now, that is a very broad and sweeping statement, and it's really written that way. What that's meant to say is that for any of us as Canadians, if we are aware of something that involves terrorist financing, we have a duty to act. So we cannot do something that deliberately helps someone finance terrorism, and we cannot fail to do something if that something would have stopped someone from financing terrorism. Now, please don't think that this means that in any way you need to be doing heroics or putting yourself in harm's way. Vis-a-vis this legislation, this means that you need to file a report. If you suspect, and you don't have to know, you don't have to be certain, but if you suspected that there is any type of transaction or any type of terrorist activity that's happening, then you need to report that. And we'll talk a little bit more later about those reports. The difference between the two is that money laundering always starts with a crime. Terrorist financing, on the other hand, can start with a number of activities that are legitimate or seemingly legitimate, but end in terrorism. And we've had a number of cases in Canada where there have been registered charities where people were donating in the Canadian context, not realizing that once this money had moved through a number of different financial institutions and a number of different sort of holders of the purse strings, it was actually going to a terrorist organization to fund terrorist activities. Fintrac is the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. They are our financial intelligence unit, which means that they collect reports from our industry and every other type of reporting entity in Canada. And this ranges from banks to securities dealers to money services businesses, so folks that conduct foreign exchange or send money. It includes the real estate sector, which has gotten a lot of attention in Canada recently. But in terms of actual physical goods, there is jewelers and the real estate sector. Most of the other industries are very heavily weighted towards financial industries in terms of reporting entities. We submit reports to Fintrac, and they also have the right to examine our compliance with Canadian requirements. That means that they can come in, they can compel your records, they can ask questions of yourself, your staff, any agents that you have, and you are required to provide these things under the law. All Fintrac correspondences and inquiries, and I can't stress this enough, when you do your training with your staff, should go to your compliance officer and should be treated as urgent. If you get a call from someone at Fintrac or someone claiming to be at Fintrac, I know that sometimes it's our gut to want to be as helpful as possible, but you should get that person's information and get that into the hands of your compliance officer so that they are the person who is the main point of contact with the regulator. If you don't comply, so there are these obligations that we're going to talk about, what can happen if you're offside. Fines and administrative monetary penalties, these can range up to millions of dollars, and that, of course, affects the business and the profits. The publication of a business's name as non-compliant. So this can affect a business's reputation, but it can also affect the ability to maintain customer and supplier relationships. And one of the supplier relationships that isn't always front of mind for us in the jewelry industry are our banking relationships. I suspect that there are probably a number of people on this call that have received a letter from their bank that says, please send us a copy of your anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing compliance program, or they've had to answer a questionnaire for their bank. And one of the things that happen if you're seen as being non-compliant is that your bank can actually close your accounts, and then it can become very difficult to get new bank accounts. And the final consequence that can happen are criminal penalties or imprisonment. This, of course, can affect the freedom of an individual as well as the company's reputation. I can't stress enough here that if you have a bad Fintrac exam, if something is a little bit offside in terms of your examination, you are not going to jail. You may have something like an administrative monetary penalty, but the cases in Canada where there has been a criminal prosecution have truly involved individuals that were complicit in wrongdoing. And what that means is simply not that I didn't realize that I had an obligation and didn't do that obligation, but that someone had come into my store and said, hey, we'd like to work out a scheme with you where we make it look like we're putting a bunch of items on hold. We'll give you cash. You give us company checks. You, of course, deposit the cash in your account. And because you're such swell guys, you can keep 10% of that cash. Isn't that great? No work for you. No stock actually leaves the store. But we'd like to do maybe a couple $1 million of transactions like this a month. And so that works out quite nicely for you financially. But then at that point, you're aiding and abetting a criminal. You are actually actively laundering money. And that would be an issue. That would be a point where there would be potentially a criminal prosecution as opposed to simply a finding for noncompliance. So those responsibilities under the law. Before I start into this, I want to stress that these apply to you if you are a jeweler. Once you've met that threshold for being a dealer in precious metals and stones, it doesn't matter if you have one location or 60. It doesn't matter if you have one staff member or 1,000 staff members. These will apply to you equally. So the first is to appoint a compliance officer. A compliance officer is going to be the point person for compliance. They don't need to be someone that you hire, so it doesn't have to be an external hire. It doesn't have to be someone from the outside. But there are a couple of conditions that they'll need to meet to be effective. One of those is that they should either be up to speed on Canadian compliance requirements for jewelers, or they should be able to get up to speed relatively quickly. There are a ton of resources that are available. For most people that I know that are business people, you're all very smart people. Being a compliance officer is not outside of the scope of things that you can do, but you have to put in the time and effort to do those things. The next is that person has to have appropriate access to your senior management team. And so I can't simply have someone who is a retail teller who's in on the weekend and say, great, Judy, you're the compliance officer now. Because she doesn't have that access to senior management, she doesn't have the authority to potentially tell other staff members what they need to do if they're offside in terms of compliance. And she might not feel comfortable going to the senior management team and saying, there was an issue over the weekend and there was something that we should have reported and didn't. So this really should be someone with the right level of authority within the organization. I hate to pick on folks with accounting backgrounds, but if you have someone with an accounting background in your organization, they tend to be very comfortable with a lot of compliance concepts, so that if you haven't nominated a compliance officer yet, that's probably a good first stop. The next thing that you need to do is develop policies and procedures. In a very simple way, a policy describes what you have to do, and a procedure describes what you're doing to meet those obligations. These need to be fairly detailed, and they are specific to each business. So we get the question fairly often in terms of, could you just give us a fill in the blank? Could you give us something other than the tool that you have online that takes an hour to go through and answer all of these questions about how we do things? Can't it be simpler? And the answer is that this is getting more and more complex each year. Fintrac's expectations are shifting, and they're expecting people to understand compliance. They're expecting these documents to become very detailed and really talk about step by step, what is the process that you follow to make sure that you're meeting these obligations. The third is a risk assessment. And this is a document that talks about the risk that your business could be used to launder money or finance terrorism. A risk assessment usually talks about risk in two ways. So it will talk about inherent risk, which is the risk if it's the Wild West, before any controls have been applied, and it will talk about risk that is residual or after controls. So once I've done everything that I need to do, once I have my policies and procedures in place, my compliance officer is there, I've trained my staff, I've tested it on a regular basis, how much risk is left over? Fintrac has put out some very good risk assessment guidance, But one of the things that you will find is that in that risk assessment guidance, there are certain things, for example, the sale of diamonds or the sale of gold, that Fintrac is considering to be high risk inherently. So before any controls are applied, Fintrac is saying that these things are inherently high risk. It is my recommendation at this point that everyone has a look at that risk assessment guidance. And from a pragmatic perspective, if Fintrac has said something is high risk, you will need a very detailed and documented rationale if you're going to say otherwise. And you should also expect, if that happens, a little bit of tension in your exam, because Fintrac will ask you to explain that rationale and specifically to explain why it's different than the ratings that Fintrac had provided in their guidance. Next, you'll need to train your employees. And this means any employee that deals with a customer or that deals with customer transactions. If you have someone on your staff that is a designer, that simply does design work, they never have a conversation with a customer, they are never punching in a transaction, they're never looking at your IT system, they are creating things and that's all they're doing, they wouldn't need to be trained. If you have a person who is a cleaner in your store, so they come in at night after everyone else has left, they're cleaning up, they of course don't need to be trained, because they're not touching anything that would look like money laundering or terrorist financing risk. But as soon as a staff member deals with a customer or a customer's transactions, then that person should be trained. And the last thing is effectiveness reviews. These are like an audit, but for compliance. So it's a test of the effectiveness. How well is everything working? Have you done everything that you're supposed to do? And not just is it in place, but is it effective? This is required every 2 years. It's something that you can do internally. So if you have the knowledge and the expertise on your staff, you can do those externally. You can also engage an external party to do that for you. That's one of the services that Outlier provides, and there are a lot of other great companies that do this work as well. So in terms of keeping your program up to date, whether or not there have been any changes, you should be looking at that compliance program. It's not enough just to put it in the binder, say we have the binder, great, put it on the shelf. Every year you should be looking at this to say, has anything changed? So do we have any different obligations? Did any of our processes internally change? Did anything about our risk assessment change from last time? Training, you'll need to do that once a year, and effectiveness review again every 2 years. There are times where even though the requirement is to update those policies, procedures, risk assessment once a year, you may do it more often. And these are if there have been changes to the law, if there have been changes to your business model. For instance, if I was always selling in a storefront model, and now we're moving to an online retail model as well, then I want to stop and look at my risk assessment and think about what the risks of that online business are and what controls we need to put in place in order to mitigate that risk. So how are Fintrac exams going? There's some bad news here when we look at this. So this is data from a meeting that we had with Fintrac earlier this year. Most of the data only goes up until about December of 2016. So Fintrac's years are partial years, so they take part of 2016, part of 2017, and for their own statistical purposes, that's a single year. For the most part, people have compliance officers. So on these charts, I think they're pretty intuitive. The green means that passed with flying colors, no issues. The yellow would mean that there's a potential issue. So for instance, in the case of a compliance officer, where we have that yellow slice, that could be an instance where, Judy, the weekend cashier, had been nominated as the compliance officer, and she didn't really have the knowledge. She didn't have the access to your management team. She didn't really understand what that entailed. And she wasn't able to be effective in that role. And the 17%, so the red tranche, would mean that there's no compliance officer that's been appointed. So we see, as we move through these pie charts, more and more red. So more jewelers that don't have a risk assessment, more jewelers that don't have training, and an awful lot of folks that haven't had a 2-year review. I should mention when I talk about the ability to do the 2-year review internally, if you look at this and it gives you a little chill of panic, part of the compliance kit that we have online that is available without charge, so no charge to members of Jewellers Vigilance Canada and Canadian Jewellers Association, that has a kit. And when I talk about if there's a person in your organization that has a little bit of an accounting background, who's familiar with audit concepts, this really shouldn't be too difficult for them to do. I'm not saying that it's not difficult. I'm not saying that it doesn't take time, but that's the right person if you want to take a look at it within your organization and see about having that done, because you need a little bit of an inherent love of spreadsheets. The good news is that there have only been 4 penalties for Canadian jewelers so far in Canada. And in each of those instances, these elements have been missing. The other thing that I think is important to know about penalties for jewelers in Canada is that generally speaking, those have not been a first exam. So it hasn't been the first time that Fintrac has called and gotten a hold of that jeweler. They've come in, they've done an exam, there were no policies or procedures in place, and they said, here's a penalty. Generally, the first time that they come in, they're trying to do a little bit more education with people. But in the case of even a first exam, if it was perceived that other things were going wrong as well, then there might still be a penalty in that case. So as I mentioned before, having a binder is not enough. Having that program in place with those 5 elements is not enough. There's still a number of things that you need to do. And when I talk about things that you need to do, please remember that you also need to document them. It is incredibly important that in the case of an examination or that 2-year review, that you can prove each of those things that you've done. So if you're in doubt, document, document, document. The first of those, surprisingly, is record keeping. So anything that you need to keep a record of for anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist financing purposes, you need to keep for at least 5 years. If you aren't sure whether or not it's something you should keep, either ask your compliance officer or hang on to that record until that 5-year period has ended. Fortunately, a lot of the things that you would be keeping for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing record-keeping purposes are going to overlap with the types of things that you would want to keep for inventory and tax purposes, which you would need to keep for 7 years in any case. And so those generally should be things that you're hanging on to. In terms of reporting, there are 3 types of transactions that need to be reported. Suspicious transactions, and those are broken into 2 types. So completed suspicious transactions, something that someone had actually done, and attempted suspicious transactions. So when we look at the example that I talked about earlier, where I said, if I come into your store and I say, hey, I'd like to start, putting these items on layaway and giving you cash, but you never actually have to give me an item, just, write me a check and keep part of the money. If you say to me, oh, no, Amber, sorry, that's not really a good business practice since we can't do that and you have to go along on your way, you would still be reporting that to Fintrac as an attempted suspicious transaction because clearly there was something happening there that wasn't above board. Large cash transactions, and in the case of cash, cash always means cash. It doesn't mean card. It doesn't mean Bitcoin. It doesn't mean anything else. Cash only means cash, bills and coins. So any transaction within the same multiple transactions within the same 24-hour period in cash of $10,000 or more. And finally, terrorist property reports. So anytime that you think that you might be in possession of something that belongs to a terrorist or terrorist group. Some quick notes on reporting. In any situation where you need to submit a report, those are the same situations that you either need to identify the customer, so you need to collect information and identification from the customer, or if you try to do that and fail, then you need to document what you did to try to identify the customer and why that didn't work. The thing that I will say about something like an attempted suspicious transaction, please don't put yourself in harm's way attempting to identify a customer. Similarly, when we talk about investigations, when I say investigation, what I mean is looking into your own records internally. And I can't stress this enough. Don't follow someone to their car and write down their license plate number. Don't get in your car and follow that car to another secondary location. Don't sneak into that secondary location and peer in the windows. There is no expectation that you are going to do the type of investigations that the police do. Leave those to the police. You are simply collecting the information that you can collect when that person is in your environment. The other thing that we're going to come back to is the same events that trigger reporting will also trigger identification, and they can also potentially trigger something called a business relationship. So starting with large cash transactions, this is the case where customers must be identified. And so if someone is giving you $10,000 or more in cash, you must collect their identification in order to complete that transaction. It's okay in this case to tell a customer, number one, that you have to report the large cash transaction. Number two, that you are legally required to collect this information in order to complete that transaction. At this point, I think most people in the Canadian context are very used to providing this type of information when they go to their banks, when they go to other financial institutions. I don't really see anymore a lot of resistance. Certainly when this law came into place, in 2006 and really came into force back in 2008, we saw a lot of resistance in all types of reporting entities. Now this is no longer the case. It's been a decade. People are used to it. One of the pieces of information that you need to collect if you have a large cash transaction is information about any potential third parties. And what that means is if I come in and I'm buying a gold bar from you, I give you $20,000 cash, you give me my gold bar, you have to ask me for my identification, for information about myself, and you have to ask me, Amber, are you doing this transaction for you, or is this transaction for somebody else? Probably the answer is for me, but if it's for someone else, then you want to find out what the information is about that person. You also want to be on the alert for potential third parties where someone is coming in and they're taking instructions from another person. It seems like they're clearly doing that transaction for the other person, but they're not declaring that to be the case, because that can be a potential suspicious indicator. And when I talk about that, when I talk about buying on behalf of another person, I don't mean buying a present for another person. So for instance, if you had someone come in that was buying earrings for their girlfriend and said girlfriend was particularly bossy about which earrings she wanted, that's not really a third party to that transaction. That's someone buying a gift for another individual. Suspicious transactions. So if you have reasonable grounds to suspect that a transaction is related to money laundering or terrorist financing, you have to attempt to identify the customers. So you identify them if possible, and you have to let the compliance officer know about the transaction and why you thought it was suspicious. There is no minimum dollar value. So I can make a 1 cent, well, if we still had a cent, a 5 cent now, I suppose, transaction, and that can still potentially be suspicious. The transaction doesn't necessarily need to involve cash. Even if the transaction isn't completed, it still needs to be reported. And when I talk about reporting to the compliance officer, if you are not the compliance officer for your organization, then you would make a report internally to your compliance officer. You don't want everyone in the organization reporting something to Fintrac. You want that always being filtered through the compliance officer so that those reports are complete and they're correct and they're consistent for your business. In the case of a suspicious transaction, unlike a large cash transaction, you should not tell the customer that you are suspicious. You can simply state that it's company policy to request this information, that for security reasons you need to request additional information. However you're comfortable spinning it in terms of trying to get that identification information from them. In terms of indicators for customer behaviors, there is a lot of literature out there that will talk about, an indication that somebody might be lying. They're looking up to the left, or they're swallowing a lot, like their mouth is dry. The truth of the matter is there is no single indicator that works every time. People that are good at what they do, who are in the business of laundering money or who are looking to perpetrate some kind of scam, are going to adjust to the person that they're dealing with. And so if I'm dealing with someone who, when I walk in, they sort of raise an eyebrow and check me out, I might be very flirty in trying to get what I want from that individual. Whereas if someone looks a little bit young and a little bit insecure about their position, I might be in a real hurry. And I might yell at them, and I might be very demanding because I'm trying to throw that person off their game. I'm trying to get them to do something that they wouldn't normally do. I'm trying to get them to not ask me for ID. I'm trying to get them not to follow the appropriate process. always trust your instincts. If you're the compliance officer, if something feels fishy about it, write down the indicators and file a report. If you're a staff member, same thing, except file your report with the compliance officer. In terms of the indicators in a transaction, look for things that are unusual given what you know about the customer, transactions that don't make sense, purchase amounts that are in cash that are just under the reporting thresholds. So we know that $10,000 is a reporting threshold, so any $10,000 transaction over the course of 24 hours. If I'm coming in every second day and I'm buying $9,500 bar of gold or $9,500 in ingots of silver, especially those types of things where they retain their value, they can be transferred easily from person to person. Really look for those if they're just under the reporting thresholds and question why that is. Now, it may be that that's the price of that particular item, and I think there's something that's a little bit different about me saying, oh, how much is that one? That's $9,000, I'll take it, versus me coming in and saying, do you have any bars of gold that are worth between $9,000 and $9,500? Those are very different transactions in terms of how the customer has approached you and what they're asking for. You don't, again, have to know that a transaction is related to criminal activity. So there's a standard that we have in the courts called beyond a reasonable doubt about whether someone's innocent or guilty. What you need in this case is reasonable grounds to suspect, which is very different. It's a much lower standard. If you think that the transaction is fishy, you think it's unusual, you think it's weird, you've probably met the standard. Again, it doesn't need to be completed to be reported. And there are a couple of different situations where I think it absolutely must be reported. The first is if a customer changes their transaction to avoid being identified. So if I'm coming in and I'm buying a watch, that watch is $12,000, I lay the cash out on the counter and you say, okay, I'm going to need your ID, Amber. And I say, oh, okay, well, how about if I give you $9,900 and then I put the rest on my Visa? Then you don't have to report it, right? I'm telling you that I'm changing the structure of my transaction so that it isn't reported. I think it's very hard to justify that in any way to say that that wouldn't be a suspicious transaction. If a customer refuses to be identified in a situation where identification is normal, so if I really want this item, I really want to pay cash for it, and then you say, I'm sorry, Amber, I can't do this cash transaction for you unless you show me your driver's license. I take my wallet and taking cash out of it, there's a driver's license in there, and I say, no, forget it then, I walk out. That to me is an attempted suspicious transaction. If you believe that a customer may have provided false or misleading information about their identity, and for instance, if I've introduced myself to you as Amber, if we have been talking, for this entire time, I bought a couple items, and then the first time that I hand you my identification document to be identified, my name is Maureen, and my middle name isn't Amber. And there's no real reason, you can bring that up sort of casually in conversation. Say, oh, that's funny, I thought your name was Amber. And I say, oh, well, really? What does that license say? Like I don't even know. You've hit reasonable grounds to suspect. Or if a customer tells you that they're paying for an item with the proceeds of crime. And I know that this seems utterly stupid, but it happens more often than I'd like to believe. Terrorist property. So here, if you or your company are in possession of any funds, any physical goods that you believe belong to a terrorist or a terrorist group, if you're a staff member, notify the compliance officer immediately. If you're the compliance officer, you need to make a determination. So, does this money, if it's something on layaway or the item that may be in for cleaning or repair, really belong to a terrorist or terrorist organization? And then there has to be a notification that goes out to the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, so CSIS, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, as well as Fintrac. This report needs to be done without delay. So that's generally interpreted to mean that it's done on the same day. These are also incredibly rare, and I would encourage you, if you are in a situation where you think that you might have terrorist property in your possession, give me a call. We'll put you in touch with someone at the RCMP. We'll do a little bit of digging to make sure that that's actually the case. One of the things that can happen in terrorist property cases that isn't a lot of fun is that there can be a duty to actually freeze that money or freeze that property. So the individual or group that is believed to be a terrorist or terrorist organization can't access it. But of course, this is going to lead to threats of lawsuits and things like that. So you want to make sure that it is the same individual that's a listed person or entity. Sending reports to the compliance officer. Compliance officers, encourage your staff to do this. You know, if you're staff and you have a report to submit to the compliance officer, those should be submitted the same day that the incident occurs. So all of these things that need to be reported have specific timelines. Those shouldn't sit on someone's desk. They're better when they're done fresh, so that if the compliance officer has any questions about the person, the transaction, the behavior, you're able to recall that. So sooner is always better than later. If you're manager of non-compliant staff, do give them the time, so whether it's time away from the counter, time off the phones, to be able to fill out these reports. The other thing to remember is that we are all protected as long as we're making a report under Canadian law in good faith. And what in good faith means is that if I submit a report that says that I suspect there is money laundering or terrorist financing activity going on, I am submitting that report because I believe that there is potentially money laundering or terrorist financing going on, or rather I suspect there is money laundering or terrorist financing activity going on. I am not submitting that report because the person that conducted the activity is my ex-boyfriend and I think he's kind of a jerk and I'd like to see police show up at his house. As long as there really were the reasonable grounds to suspect, and that is the reason that you're submitting the report, you are protected under Canadian law, meaning that the person about whom you filed the report will not know that you are the person that filed the report. It means that those reports cannot be compelled in court. And this is something that has been tested in Canada a number of times. Those reports form the basis. So the report goes to Fintrac. Fintrac feeds the information to law enforcement. And law enforcement then needs to conduct an investigation. They need far more than our reports in order to be able to make a case against an individual and have that case brought to court. The things that are tested in court are really the strength of the case that law enforcement has made. It's not the strength of these reports that have come from Fintrac. In fact, these can't even be compelled into court. So that's important to know. Especially if you're worried about making a report against someone who may retaliate. They simply won't know that this has happened. In terms of identifying your customers, when you identify them, so if you're face-to-face, you can look at a piece of ID, and I'll talk about the characteristics of that momentarily. There are also specific methods that you can use if you are dealing with your customers online, so in a non-face-to-face context. You need to record certain information about your customer if you need to identify them, their name, their address, their date of birth, information about the identification itself, so the ID number, like your driver's license number or your passport number, the place and country of issue, the expiry date. You also need to record the occupation or principal business of your customer when you need to identify them. And this should be as specific as possible. So in my case, what I would often write for occupation would be consultant, but this would be too vague. You would want to know what type of consultant I am. So in my case, I'm a compliance consultant, or I'm the owner of a compliance consulting firm. If the customer is a company, you're going to identify the signing authority, so who's the person who's acting on behalf of the company, and you're going to collect certain information about the company itself. For individuals and signing authorities, if you're meeting with them in person, you're looking at a piece of physical ID, it has to bear their name, it has to be an original, so not a scan, a fax, or a photocopy, and holding it up to the monitor if you're talking to someone in Skype doesn't work either, unfortunately. It has to bear a unique identifier. So it's just a number, a passport number, a driver's license number. It has to be valid. So it can't be expired. It can't have been invalidated for any other reason. It has to be issued by a federal, territorial government, provincial government, or the foreign equivalent. And it has to bear a photo of the individual that's being identified. As part of your process, you should also be looking at that photo so that if I'm presenting an identification, you've looked at it and you've said, okay, this is a picture of Amber. This is not a picture of Rodney or some other person. Provincial health cards, although they generally meet all of the standards that I just talked about, are not accepted as identification in a number of provinces and territories. So what that means is that there is a law within the province itself that says you cannot use a health card as identification in order to do anything except access healthcare services. If you aren't certain about a province's stance, use another type of ID. Ask for a driver's license, ask for a passport. Most provinces and territories, I think with the exception of Quebec at this point, actually have a provincial ID card that can be issued very inexpensively. So I know here in Ontario, they are $35 for an individual that doesn't drive and doesn't have a passport. So they're meant to be simply a low-cost form of photo ID. Non-face-to-face identification, if you need to identify someone and you're not going to meet with them to look at a piece of ID, you can still do that a number of different ways. So you can use a credit file that's been in existence more than 3 years and match their name, address, and date of birth to that credit file and keep records associated with that. Equifax and TransUnion, who are our two credit bureaus in Canada, have methods of doing this so that you're not actually affecting someone's credit score. So it's not the same as if someone's applying for a credit card and there's an effect on their credit score. They have specific products that are just used for identification. If you do an online business, I would highly recommend looking into those. You can also use a combination of two different reliable sources to confirm two out of these three things. So I can use something that confirms the name and address. This can be something as simple as a utility bill. So a phone bill, a cable bill, electricity bill, something like that. Something that confirms your name and date of birth. And this gets a little bit more complicated because not very many documents that get sent to me from any official source have my date of birth on them, with the exception of documents that come to me from Canada Revenue Agency. And people don't generally share an awful lot of their CRA information, but that is something that you could use. And the last one is that I have an account with a Canadian financial institution. So this could be a statement, this could be a check that's cleared, this could be any number of different things. This can even be a call. So you can get on a call with the person, you get on a three-way call. You should dial the number from a security perspective. So, dial the number for BMO if they have an account with BMO. They would authenticate themselves with BMO and then say to the rep on the phone, so you're confirming that I have a bank account with BMO. You would get the information that you needed for your records, and you would keep a record that you called BMO on that specific date, and that was how you verified that they had an account with BMO. You will not get an awful lot of information from any of these institutions placing a call on your own. That really only works if you have the person on the line with you. All of the documentation that you keep must be in its original format. So again, not a scan or other type of copy. This means that if my utilities company, if I'm using a utility bill to identify myself to you, and my utilities company sends me my bill as a PDF, I can forward you that PDF. But if they send me a paper document, I can't scan that paper document and send you a PDF. These can seem like a little bit of a headache. They are much more friendly than the previous version. And again, as a jeweler, there are very limited circumstances in which you need to deal with these identification methods. Again, only in the situations where you need to identify your customers. If your customer is an organization, so a business, a charity, anything like that, you need to collect some additional information about that organization. That has to include proof that it exists. This can be something like articles of incorporation, and you need information about anybody who owns or controls 25% or more of the organization. And these are called beneficial owners. You'll need to ask whether or not the organization is a not-for-profit. If it's a non-for-profit, is it a registered charity, and does it solicit donations from the public? You'll also need to collect some additional documentation just to confirm who owns the organization. And again, this can also be included in those articles of incorporation. So oftentimes, especially for small businesses, these can be in a single document. Business relationships. This is probably the ickiest term in AML because to you and I, business relationships mean something completely different. When we're talking about anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, when we're talking about this legislation in Canada, business relationships has a very narrow definition. And what it means is that you have conducted 2 or more transactions that require identification. So again, suspicious transaction, attempted suspicious transaction, large cash transaction, terrorist property report. So these types of things, if they've happened, and generally what we're seeing is that there might be 2 or more large cash transactions, then you have to collect and record the nature and purpose of the business relationship. So why am I your customer? What is it that I hope to accomplish? Why am I doing business with you overall? If you're a wholesaler, I might have paid you in cash more than once because I don't have great credit with you. And so you've asked me to pay you in cash. And the nature and purpose of our business relationship is that I'm a retailer buying products from you as a wholesaler. You need to then risk rate that customer. And when I talk about risk rate, I mean, what is the risk that this customer could somehow use our business in order to launder money or finance terrorism? What is the risk associated with this customer? And I need to consider the products, services, and delivery channels that they're using, the geography, so where are they located, and the characteristics of that customer themselves, as well as any other relevant factors that might come to mind. I need to monitor the transactions of that customer if I have a business relationship with them. So I need to take a look at their account on an ongoing basis and say, does this activity make sense? Do I know what's happening here, or does it look like money laundering or terrorist financing? And the last thing that I have to do, if I've decided when I risk rated that customer that they're high risk, I need to do enhanced due diligence and enhanced transaction monitoring. And that means that I need to do something different than I do for everyone else that I have a business relationship with because I'm considering them higher risk. So I need to do something special to mitigate that risk. In terms of how Fintrac exams are going on the operational part, so everything outside of those 5 elements of the compliance program, here, Jewellers are actually doing really good. And I think this is a really good news story, especially because I look at these same statistics across other industries as well. So those large cash transactions, they're being reported. Only 7% went unreported. That 20% that's yellow, so there may have been an issue with the report. So maybe a field wasn't filled out correctly. Maybe the report was sent in, but it was sent in late. Those are relatively good numbers, and I think that they've been improving year over year. Fintrac is definitely encouraging the sector to continue to submit reports. And when you're submitting those reports, if it's late, it's always better to submit a late report than not to have submitted that report at all. In terms of how Fintrac assesses the seriousness of a deficiency if they come in and examine you, don't think that because a report is a couple days late, you shouldn't still submit it to Fintrac. If you're wondering, how do we find out about all of this Fintrac stuff that is going on, I have to do a quick little plug. So this is a page from Fintrac's website. They actually have a mailing list. You can just Google Fintrac mailing list, and it will probably bring you to this exact page. You can also get there from Fintrac's homepage, and you can subscribe to updates from Fintrac. Unfortunately, it's not very granular, so you get a mixed bag of things. But one of the things that you always get from Fintrac in terms of these updates is, changes to the regulations. They're not sector specific, so you'll get, you might get hear about a change to the regulations that only affects banks, but I think it's better to hear about it than not. So I am going to stop there. My contact information is up on the screen. So if there are any specific questions that involve a client, that involve a particular situation, that involve the name of your business that you don't want to bring up in the context of this call, please do reach out to me. The link that appears, so our website, outliercanada.com/CJA or -JBC, will link you to both the CJA and JBC pages that talk about all of those tools that are available for free to CJA and JBC members. And from there, I'm actually going to, at this point, just stop recording and open up the line and take questions. So give me just a moment.